and gentlemen. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Um, it's a privilege to be here amongst you on the 100th birth anniversary of Geoffrey Bawa to present to you what would probably be a far more formal lecture than my friend Bijoy gave you a few minutes ago. But something struck of some of the things he said, and you'll probably see some of the slides that I'm going to show you, which will contain some of those ideas that Bijoy spoke about of that kind of in between on what is outside, what is inside, what is human, what is not, and so on. And that is very much a part of Bawa's legacy. And talking of legacies, you wonder what is it? What is a legacy? A legacy is a legacy, a physical legacy, and that's probably what I'll be talking to you about this evening. But it's also a legacy of thought, it's a legacy of an attitude to life, an attitude to architecture that is more special. Last evening, my partner Sean, who's in New York, met a Syrian architect at one of the opening parties of the new Museum of Modern Art that opened very recently. The architect had been very excited to know that my partner knew Geoffrey Bawa and was associated with Sri Lanka and so on. And then he sort of said, as a student in Damascus, Bawa was one of the few architects that they had to study and look at. And like Bijoy said, he had seen the buildings, he had heard the buildings through the books and so on. And of course, he had the privilege of seeing it. And this guy went on to become a young architect, working in the beginnings of the war in Syria with villages which were being bombed and broken out and so on. But working with them to try and give the villagers resilience and self-reliance through constructing things with very simple materials, local technology, and local skills. And he said that, and he had said, look, that's really what Bawa inspired me to do things locally, with locally found things, and so on. And last year, he had made the pilgrimage to Sri Lanka and looked at all of his buildings, simply to understand what is it that really touched him. To carry on building and working in terribly trying circumstances. And he had said, look, something that we learned about Bawa's work actually inspired me to do that. And that was really wonderful hearing it this morning about someone who had just simply met. And for me, in many ways, that's a legacy. And of course, Geoffrey Bawa died about 15 years ago. And it's been a long time, and it's wonderful to see the reception his work is still getting, the kind of admiration that the man manages to still get for himself and his work. Of course, the basis of Bawa's work, so I pointed this way to go forward, is because he kind of set himself up in his country, understood what his country was about, and really worked within the context of worked on his context as a generator of most of his ideas. His work responded to and embraced the legacy of history and culture and materials that was within the country of Sri Lanka, which he called home. And this is an image of a map of the world that he had on the first book that was published by him. He insisted on having this particular image, which is Sri Lanka as the center of the world, which in many ways was also the center of his practice and the center of the way he thought about his architecture. And of course, I'm just going to show you a few images of what the country looks like for those who might not have been there. And in many ways, I'm following in the footsteps of what Bawa did when he presented his work. He wanted to show people, this is where I work. Because often, but you can't do this here or there or somewhere else is a question that architects are asked. But you couldn't do this in Norway, I was asked once. I said, of course you couldn't do it in Norway, and that's why I live in Sri Lanka. So Geoffrey used to always show these set of images to say, look, this is the context within which I work. Of course, I'm showing the most beautiful part of it. There's always different ways of looking at a country. But in Sri Lanka, I think the perception of Sri Lanka is these images, the kind of history that it has had over the years, these wonderful bodies of water that was the center of an ancient civilization that went through almost 2,000 years. And the key, of course, is the way people sort of handle the landscape. This is paddy field, obviously like Kerala as well, but in Sri Lanka, really the center of a culture that managed to produce an extraordinary network of an extraordinary culture that has stood for so many years. And Geoffrey's attitude to architecture probably comes from his interaction first with that landscape. Long before he was an architect, after he had sort of studied as a lawyer, come back to Sri Lanka, he decided just to be a dilettante, do nothing, and thought what he might just simply do to make a garden in what he called was, and following in an ancient tradition, of course, and these are some of the things that you would still see in Sri Lanka, and in what he called Sri Lanka as the setting, the garden setting, the greater garden setting of his garden, he began to make this thing that we call Lunuganga in 1947. This is some imagery of it. Just after the monsoon, the reeds have been cut, water has filled in, the first paddies are coming in, and the garden was also something that began to record something that Bijoy was talking about, the seasons. And while we don't have the kind of strong seasons that we would have anywhere else, we do have the monsoon. We do have the phases of the moon, and in Sri Lanka we have a holiday on each of the full moons. That gives us very clear notion of the fact that time is passing. And Lunuganga was really his first idea of changing the landscape so that he might enjoy it. And it was done long before he became an architect, just simply for the sake of pleasure. Quite an extraordinary place where it's very difficult to tell where nature ends and man begins to take over. And sitting on this very terrace, and I'm going to go through this lecture also always with a few anecdotes, was the last time I ever spoke with him, because the next day he had a stroke and couldn't speak. And that night he sat on this very terrace and said, if anything should happen to me, just make sure these lawns are cut and we could sit up here and watch nature take over the garden again. Of course, I've completely disobeyed his orders and gone on to keep Lunuganga so that we will still sort of have the sentimentality of looking at it. But his final instructions were that simply keep these lawns cut and let the rest go back to jungle. Now, the last question that was asked of Bijoy, this idea that what would happen, do you build for things to fall apart? I don't think he builds for things to fall apart, but you build in anticipation of time. And in many ways, that little lesson to me, the last lesson I got from Geoffrey, in his words, was just let time pass. And time pass will change things. And if we as architects think that we can stop time, and often a lot of architects do think that, I think we're making a mistake. And people ask, what will happen when that tree dies? I said, well, the tree dies. And you plant another tree. So you just understand that, in fact, when he planted it the first time, that he planted 2 branches. And if you understood that, then you might just about manage to get something like this. But you need to understand what you do. It's like that core that Bijoy tries to put in his work. Understand something that will remain, understand some little bit of knowledge that comes from before, place it back in the landscape, and then you're going to go through it. Here again, it's extraordinary little part of, you would think, is this manicured, is it not? You're not really sure of what's going on. In series of black and white photographs taken by Geoffrey and my friend Dominic Sanzoni, you begin to wonder where that happened. Now, there is a building in this picture. But is there a building in this picture? What is its purpose? What is it doing there? But it's there. It's sort of showing that man can place his hand, but something else will come over and take over again. Once again, just a touch of the hand of man climbing up that stair, and the rest just allowed to become whatever it becomes. And this was really the beginning of Geoffrey's connection with architecture. And I think from the of dealing with making things, he understood that you make only to give it up. And that, I think, in many ways reflected in almost all of his work. Although what I'm going to talk to you about is a slightly more academic side of what Geoffrey Bawa's legacy was within the context of within the context of modern architecture in our part of the world. And to begin that story, and of course another thing about Lunuganga was that while he was doing all of this, he also used it as a kind of crucible for some of the thoughts that he had. On the right-hand side was a chicken coop that was built. In the 1970s, when he had to pretend in our socialist environment that his garden was in fact a farm, and this was so that his chickens could be kept. They must have been the most expensive eggs in the world. But you also see the floating roof here beginning to reappear in Parliament almost 15 years later, an understanding of how a double cantilevered roof structure would give you a much more floating feeling in a roof. Similarly, for the 1974 structure, this 1969 building begins to look at arches, and I begin to think, yes, perhaps he was confident to do this bigger building because he'd made a smaller structure in Lunuganga. So Lunuganga goes on to become all of that. And this is one of the few statements Bawa made. In my personal search, I have looked into the past for the help that previous answers can give, and at the pointers of previous mistakes. By the past, I mean all the past from Anuradhapura, which is the classical capital of Sri Lanka from the 5th century BC to almost the 10th century AD, to the latest finished building in Colombo. From Polonnaruwa, which was our medieval capital, to the present moment. The whole range of effort, the peaks of beauty and simplicity, and the deep valleys of potential, all of which we can learn from. And for Bawa, it was very, very important. As he said, what you see and what you don't see is as important at the same level. So his early career began as an architect, formerly having trained at the Architectural Association School, with a sort of lean towards modernity. The modern movement was at that point, I might even say, rampant. That was the most important set of ideas about architecture that was prevalent at the time. And in this school for St. Bridget's College in Colombo, he begins to look at all the sort of rules of modernism, the frame structure and all of that, concrete, poured concrete, precast concrete, all of that, and begins to build a series of buildings in that mold. He's built several of them. This is St. Thomas's College soon after that. And again, in the mid-60s, he begins to use the same idiom but adds a roof because he understands at some point that a flat roof doesn't really keep the monsoon out. So he begins to say, okay, perhaps there is a flexibility in creating concrete buildings, but we need to change that slightly. And that was one train of thought that he had. The second train of thought was perhaps a little bit more interesting because he began to understand that modern buildings were modern buildings, that in fact it was about space. And again, the conversation was had previously. Architecture is not really about the objects you make, but the accommodation you make for people to live their lives. And modern buildings had a certain kind of accommodation that our traditional buildings probably didn't have. Gave us opportunity to have different kinds of relationships that traditional buildings prevented us from doing. On the left-hand side is a picture of a house is a plan of a house by Mies van der Rohe. And on the right-hand side is a plan of a house that Geoffrey Bawa built in 1959 in Gaul. We were supposed to set this page out. And you can kind of say, well, obviously he's been definitely influenced by the kind of spaces modernism allowed us to make. But did you have to make it out of the materials that modernism tended to dictate as a style? And for the first time, he began to build that house in a completely different set of materials, and that's the kind of house that came out of it. It uses everything that's local, stone, terracotta tiles, coconut timber for its railings, timber, ceilings, and all of that. So in every way, it's a modern house in terms of space and the kind of relationships it allows and the kind of life it allows you to lead, but it's rooted in the local because he's beginning to use local materials, local skills, local crafts. And suddenly we have an architecture that is somehow rooted in place, but still very modern. So this exploration, of course, Bawa took on for quite a few more projects. And in the place of where Mies van der Rohe might have put the fireplace, he puts in a courtyard, and it makes it a very Sri Lankan, very South Asian, and in fact very Asian house. but still allowing you the kind of looseness of space that modern life requires. In another experiment, this is quite interesting, in which he looks at the traditional Sri Lankan courtyard house, which is a series of rooms around the courtyard, and begins to look at how that might be, perhaps, I mean, I'm using words, I'm putting words into Geoffrey Bawa's mouth, I suppose, now that he's not around, in deconstructing that to create a locally rooted set of spaces. Once again, using an extraordinary set of local materials, he creates a modern house with open spaces, which kind of conjures up the idea of a traditional house, but not for a moment is it traditional, because you can see right through the house, from one end of the house to the other, which you couldn't have done in a traditional house. You can move in loosely through all of those spaces. And here, the Silva house, he kind of in many ways managed to, again, 1961, when it's finished, he managed to kind of bridge that gap in many ways between what modernism was about and how you might root it locally. And of course, the post-history of the Ina de Silva house is that it was so important in the modern architectural history of the country, that when it had to be demolished, because the client, Ina de Silva, who in her own right was a great artist who worked with Geoffrey Bawa on many of his projects, needed to sell it because she needed the money. No one was willing to buy it because a hospital had been built next to this. And no one was willing to buy it as a house. So it was inevitable that it be demolished. But for the first time, the government of Sri Lanka decided to say, no, you can't demolish that. It's historic property. It became one of the first buildings in Sri Lanka, modern buildings in Sri Lanka, to be recognized as a possible historic monument. But Geoffrey Bawa Trust then sort of came into play, and we went up to the minister and said, look, this is our idea. Can we dismantle and rebuild it, and would you let us do that? And because we know that Ina de Silva is living heritage and she needs the money. And that's what we did. We stepped in and dismantled the whole thing, and what the picture you see here, the next couple of pictures, is as it now lies at Geoffrey Bawa's garden, Lunuganga, on a plot of land that we had bought. We completely dismantled and rebuilt the house. Each stone was numbered, and it's in exactly the same place that it was in the main house. I mean, a bit of a labor of love for a piece of modern architecture that changed the way, not just us, but I think a lot of Asians think about their modern world. And we're kind of looking at how it looked like in the 1960s photographs that Geoffrey Bawa had taken. We were looking for all the artwork, we'll be producing some of it, and we will have it open to the public soon. So the conflation of these two strands, the very modernist strand of what you do with concrete and what you do with all of that, and this idea that perhaps we need to do something that's different, probably comes together in the end of the 1960s, where the structural possibilities of concrete are explored by his engineer partner, Dr. Protege, in the Steel Corporation buildings of 1965, which I showed you. And it's somehow brought together, inspired by the material culture of the Essex and Ina de Silva houses, to construct the Bentota Beach Hotel, in which Pavitra, of course, swam in the pool. And the Bentota Beach, of course, is an enfilade of sort of spaces that takes you through from arriving after an exhausting drive from the airport in Colombo. In those days, we didn't have an expressway. You had to travel 3.5 hours from the airport to get to this place. You arrived completely exhausted. You got off your car or bus, and then you looked up a dark hole, and what you saw was that extraordinary sight of crazy Bati, which Ina de Silva had put there in 1968. You walked up, looked across the courtyard, and just about glimpsed the sea that you were longing after. So in many ways, he created a sort of setup of you kind of aspiring to get to that beach as soon as you can. But he framed it through his architecture, so it highlights that experience. So architecture was really about highlighting that experience. And the rooms, of course, was built by using a combination of concrete and timber. And his great inspiration for this was his favorite building in India, which is Padmanabhapuram Palace, just south of Trivandrum. And you can begin to see some of those of the Master Palace, the Mother Palace, in the center of the building, coming through in this structure. And it became the first of those international tourist hotels to somehow be rooted in the place, to give people an experience of what it might be to live in a large palace in monsoon region. Of course, this has also had its own problems, and it almost collapsed about 3 years ago. There was concrete cancer within it, and we managed to convince the client and the owner that it would be dismantled, and that's what we did. We dismantled everything that could dismantle, got down to the concrete core, and therein was an extraordinary discovery for me, because Dr. Pulakisundram retired and he's not been in circulation for a while. And I had always wondered how is it that he managed to have these really thin slabs, when everyone thought, very clever man to cantilever it out and double cantilever it. But in fact, it wasn't cantilever at all. It was the marvel of concrete that allowed it to be suspended from the roof. So the structure was quite extraordinary in that you have a very big concrete roof beam, and all these slabs were actually suspended from it. So that's where I say the marvels of modern technology was married beautifully with a sort of understanding of culture and craft to create a modern building that is rooted in place and time. Of course, this idea that modernity can't simply be taken without a pinch of salt was not a new idea for Geoffrey. Geoffrey must have been very much a part of a wider group of architects, and key to that relationship, of course, was Minette de Silva, 1950. She said, "It is essential for us to absorb what we absolutely need from the modern West and to learn to keep the best of our traditional forms. We have to think understandingly in order to develop an indigenous contemporary architecture and not lose the best of the old that has meaning and value." And in many ways, she could perhaps be considered a pioneer in that field. But for the first time, she said, she kind of in a way rebelled against the modernism that she studied. I mean, of course, if you're to believe the book that's just turned up, she had an affair with Le Corbusier himself, the great father of modern architecture. But she comes home and says, no, we really can't do what they say. We've got to do something different. And Sarmaya says they have all the Mars publications. I'm looking for that one publication where she published the Karunaratna House, and for the first time in writing said there has to be a regional, locally inspired modern architecture. And in many ways that story might have been taken to Geoffrey through a man called Uwe Plesner, who worked with Minette and then joined Geoffrey's practice a few years later. And this conversation must have been part of the way Sri Lankan architects and designers were thinking at that time. And that's some of Minette's work, where she begins to try and use local technology, local sort of crafts and skills, and incorporating that into the houses that she built. This is a house in Colombo, and these are the images of the first modern house to be built by a Sri Lankan in Sri Lanka, the Karunaratna House in Kandy. Unfortunately, this is falling apart, and probably may not be restored, but it's a historic building that requires perhaps a little bit more attention than is given at the moment. At first, these ideas were derided by Western writers and architectural press as a quaint sort of vernacular style. It's something that Geoffrey Bawa hated. He was always called a vernacular architect, when he certainly wasn't. As I demonstrated to you, he was certainly not a vernacular architect. He respected the vernacular and he took on board the idea of vernacular traditions, vernacular ways of making things, vernacular ways of looking at things, and created a modern architecture. Coming at about the same time as the postmodernist movement in Europe, with its fake colonnades and the like, that pushed back at the cultural vacuum that was created by 1970s modernism, the now so-called tropical modern movement went on to open up possibilities all over the region. Now, Geoffrey Bawa, of course, is called the father of tropical modernism. He would have hated that epithet, because he was one person who didn't really want to be labeled. Because looking at a lot of his work, you would find that each is different. And one of the things that he considered very important was that each project is seen as a challenge and an opportunity to look at different ideas and different thoughts about how people could live. The key was people living. He was once asked at the Triton Hotel why you couldn't close the front of the hotel from the monsoon. He said the whole point is that people should feel that there is the monsoon. And he said it's absolutely marvelous when the rain comes. I see these boys in their sarongs flying in the wind, bringing cats to close the front of it, and you create a whole drama of life and accept that as part of it. Like Vijay said, you let the house get wet because it's your idea and understanding of the season and what's happening around you. Because often, sitting in places like this, we don't even hear the rain. And we don't even know, oh my goodness, it's raining, you say when you go out. But in these buildings that Geoffrey Bawa was doing, it was really about trying to create an awareness of where you were and an understanding of what you need to do in, in reaction to it. I mean, you can't just be standing there and getting wet. You've got to do something. And in Geoffrey's case, it was about getting two of his staff to run along and get two cats from somewhere, hang it up on the veranda, and then you would keep the rain out into it. Or you would begin to retreat. Again, as Vijay said, you retreat. And at Lunuganga, we often retreated. When the monsoon came, it came horizontally. And you couldn't even sit in the 15-foot deep veranda. You completely retreated indoors, often to his bedroom, and you'd cower there as the sort of monsoon wind blew outside, but watching it all the time. Watching it through the verandas, watching it through the windows, and that was really about what architecture should be doing instead of isolating and insulating us from what's around that. And in 1989, this particular book, Geoffrey Bawa, was published. It became kind of the sort of reference book for loads of architects, particularly in South and Southeast Asia. I think not so much in the subcontinent here, it came a little bit later, but in Southeast Asia, he was the god. And I remember going years later to an Indonesian architect's office. All they did was not touch my feet because I had touched Geoffrey Bawa or something like that. Because he was a huge inspiration for those architects working in tropical Asia, because in many ways it gave them a kind of justification to do what they always felt they need to do. We can't just do a modern architecture, we need to take everything that's from around us and make it ours. And Bawa gave them a precedent like no one else. And of course, buildings like the Datai, like Terry Hill in Indonesia, and the Amandari, all those things that we now sort of take for granted as all these fabulous tropical resorts, and even to the extent of the Soekarno-Hatta airport in Indonesia begins to take shape in the late 70s, mid 80s, after all of these things begin to come into play. Now, that's really one of the bits of legacy that Geoffrey left behind. This idea that you need to create an architecture that allows people occupying it to respond to what is happening around them. That it does not isolate you from or insulate you from what's going on in the environment around you. And in many ways, I mean, he's talked about the man who blurred the boundary between inside and outside. And while that was physically what happened, the reality was that that allowed people who were inside or outside to kind of understand what was going on in the environment around them. And for Bawa, that was really more important than the physicality of what he managed to achieve or actually place on the ground. But one of the things about Bawa was he did work at a time when Sri Lanka was going through a very important social and economic change. In the 1950s, in fact, when we became independent, we were one of the richest countries per capita in Asia. And over a series of sort of, rather ill-founded economic and political reasons, we managed to get ourselves rather down economically. And again, we had to bring in a lot of restriction in terms of economic activity, and imports were banned, and you couldn't really bring anything from outside into the country. Very much like the early part of India's history, post-independence history. What that did, of course, to designers was that they had to learn to become self-reliant. They couldn't sort of order their chairs from Scandinavia. They couldn't get their prints from Marimekko in Norway or to get their chairs from Knoll in New York. You had to deal with making your own things. But it also meant that it didn't mean that you need to completely reproduce everything that was already in the country. You took part of that, but you also felt you needed to do something new. And Bawa was a pioneer in that side of design as well. He did a whole lot of designs for furniture, for fabric, for a whole lot of things, which is not really talked about or thought about. And this, in his 100th birth anniversary, we've been thinking about it, and I've begun to see that there's a lot of stuff that he did, which perhaps needs to be looked at and recognized. And for all of his buildings, he did at least one chair. Now, here's an image of, an exhibit that was in 2004 at the Deutsche Architecture Museum in Frankfurt, a very major retrospective that happened. And these are all the chairs he had designed for various of his buildings. This, of course, an adaptation of an old colonial chair. He pulled out the arm and they became the lounge chair of the bench at the beach. And so on and so forth. Right at the end here is a chair that he designed in glass and cane for the Triton Hotel. So there's a whole lot of this that he did, which was over and above the architecture, because he was quite keen that when people occupied a space, everything that was around them was somehow in sync with the spaces that he did. So at the Bench the Beach Hotel, for instance, you found that he worked very closely with Ina de Silva to create this extraordinary ceiling, which we are now redoing, which is a great privilege to have the same 50% of the same women who did this ceiling in 1968, now in their 70s, still doing the same thing for the third time, I think. And we're really looking forward to having this hung up at the end of November. And the spaces themselves, again, barefoot fabric. For the first time using fabric in this way in a modern building so that it somehow roots it in the place. And that's that chair that I showed you earlier, the old colonial veranda chair without its arms, but also on these concrete tables with leaf imprints on it. His brother had started leaf imprinting for tiles in his garden in the 1940s, 1930s in fact, at a garden called Brief, which was his brother's garden. And that had come from him having dropped some leaves in some concrete formwork in a garden toilet that he had done. And when they took the formwork out, there was a beautiful set of leaves on the ceiling, which he then didn't plaster, just painted over. This led to another idea, and in 1968, Bawa used these leaf imprint tables as the tables for the bench at the beach. Of course, again, we are reproducing some of it. We are learning techniques that the plethora of stuff you can now buy from China is quite extraordinary, to the extent that you really don't want to do anything yourself. So for us, it's a learning experience almost, to try and understand how was these things done. They're simple things, but we've forgotten to do them because we don't do them. And as Bijoy said, it's a fine line between being and not being, or it's still there, but you need to resurrect it. And that's what we're doing again for the bench at the beach. We're resurrecting some of these things to make it live again. And similarly, in the Triton Hotel, about 10 years after that, he began to design a whole lot of other things. He worked with Ina de Silva on buttoned fabrics, again because he couldn't import Marimekko for it. So he kind of got inspired by that and sat with Ina and started designing fabrics, which might kind of reflect the thoughts that he wanted to have within those spaces. Built-in seats, because all of that, and that wonderful little landscaping, which is actually 4 square sheets of plywood stuck together on 3 ends with a light with a little light inside it, plugged onto a plug on a built-in table. Simple, innovative ways in which you could create atmosphere and give you the kind of style that you wanted to have. And at the Kandalama Hotel, of course, he took designing the furniture much more seriously, because here at this fantastic hotel, he had a very, very minimalist aesthetic. It was about a non-architecture. And it's an architecture in which he was quite sure would eventually disappear, because he once told me that it would be finally complete when the bears are living in its rooms and leopards roam its corridors. I'll never forget that. And he said that's when the Kandalama would be complete. It's slowly getting there. In a recent Architectural Digest issue, when they wanted to include it, I said, look, let's do it as a wildlife shoot. And if you look at that edition, the July edition of AD, you'll see that Kandalama, the shoot on Kandalama is not about the hotel at all. In fact, I sent a friend of mine who's a wildlife photographer, and they simply photographed the wildlife in and around the building. And the next step, of course, is that they would move in. And I think that would be the day Geoffrey would be most thrilled that the leopards have started working. But until then, he decided that everything that he put in there has to have a certain aesthetic, and that's a set of furniture that he designed specifically for the Kandalama Hotel. Here again, shown at the Deutsche Architecture Museum as a set, and that's a sort of drawing that was done by his friend Lati Senanaika, a plan of the hotel, and he thought, and what he did was to mark every room in a tiny little red spot to say, this is your room. So in many ways, it was also the fire guide as to where you were in the hotel. And all these chairs and very simple bits of furniture designed by him. He put in a lot of effort doing it. He never drew them out though. And these are all sort of, you put a piece of paper on the ground and he would put a normal chair there, and we were expected to do the outline of that chair, and then he would take the chair out and say, okay, Channa, shift that a little to the left, shift that a little to the right, perhaps a little bit more curvature on that side. Would be given to a craftsman. He would bring a sample. We had to sit on it. Is that comfortable? Okay. And so this would go on. So there were never drawings, because remember, he was not a furniture designer. He just wanted to see a piece of furniture that looked like something he had in his mind, and this was the process by which he did it. So all these pieces were designed in that way. I mean, of course, something like that table is very straightforward, but still carefully considered. Now here you'd see this piece of round circular thing, but it's made of two pieces of wood, and he kind of stitched it with another kind of wood in between. So there was thought about everything he did, which made them beautiful objects to sit in what he considered, I think in many ways, his kind of big testament, because it was this building that would eventually be taken over by the wilderness. And of course, all of these other things that he did, he put in timber all around, but stone as a carpet. So it's this idea that you turn it the other way around. You have a timber floor with a stone carpet. And this very, very simple aesthetic, concrete and aluminum, and this extraordinary view all around. And that's really a summary of some of the work he did. In the 40 years that he worked, he designed something like 60 pieces of furniture, just chairs and tables. I haven't even got into the light fittings and everything else. And that's just 8 of the chairs that we have drawn up recently, and they're quite extraordinary variety, and each sort of dealing with the problems that each project deals. So part of his legacy was that, and this legacy of eclectic, original approach to making architecture in particular, and spaces to enjoy and live in general, has given many Sri Lankan architects and some others further afield the confidence to follow on. Looking at the work of several generations of Sri Lankan architects recently for a magazine I'm editing, I could not help but admire the lasting legacy that Geoffrey Bawa has left through his inspiration to go beyond the bounds of international modernism and make an architecture of our own. And looking at that, A+U Japan asked me to edit a sort of tribute issue, and they had one very simple proviso. Every building there should have been built after Geoffrey died in 2002. So that was the tribute they wanted to pay, that here was an architecture that was still valid, looking at in a country that this man had been. So, of course, I mean, I was slightly worried, would I find enough variety to inhabit an entire magazine? 26 projects, which needed to be of a certain quality. And I must say, I was very, very pleasantly surprised, and we had a whole lot of interesting buildings. This is a home of a architect friend of mine who also worked with Geoffrey, where again this idea of what's in, what's out, what's the experience you have, did you know outside, doesn't really matter where you have it. Yes, the rain comes all the way here, you can still have dinner, but when it's not raining, you can sit out there and still have. And when it really pours, you climb up onto the deck and have your drink, watching the rain. And all that is sort of recycled timber. It's an old recycled factory frame that she put over what were originally containers that she lived in. Eventually she made it into an elegant little house for herself. Quite an extraordinary building now being completely taken over by the jungle. Obviously, you can see that Kandalama inspired it very, very much. And of course, this is another gentleman trying to sort of recreate a Kandalama idea. It's just been built about a year and a half ago, very tall building, but managed to convince the client that you need to have gardens on every level. And I'm just hoping that that will eventually become this wonderful 16 stories, massive green, which will be part of this. This is a suburb close to Parliament, and I feel it will be quite extraordinary when all of that begins to turn out. It's designed so that it will actually have trees on the edges of the balcony. And they're all indigenous varieties that we've planted, so you don't have to look after them. They'll simply take over and just be themselves. And it's also not easy to convince a whole lot of potential buyers that they're going to have to deal with the jungle, although they're living in the middle of the city. But they've managed that, and I'm really hopeful that we'll have something extraordinary to look at in about 5 or 6 years. Again, this idea that a building is not complete when you leave it, when the architect leaves it. Other things have to take over. My own house, again, ideas of playing with recycled materials. There is no kind of, I can't air condition it. Breezes run through, and as somebody said, but rats will run through. I said, they will run through because they have no place to hide. This is totally open. And it really doesn't matter because, you know, they must live, I must live, and I mean, the other day a snake ran through it, a rat snake. Great. I mean, they're there for a moment because there's no place to hide as long as you keep it open. And it uses, for me, sentimentally, lured shutters that were thrown away from a refurbishment of the Bendigo Beach, which I'm now redoing in 1992. They were thrown out in a refurbishment, so I bought them, about 160 of them for $1,000, which is fantastic. Great deal for me. And I created this sort of open space on top, shielded only by the lures, which I can twist and twist. And like Bijoy says, about 3 days ago, soon after the full moon, I woke up at 3 in the morning and there was this extraordinary light coming through the lured shutters in the moon. And this idea that you don't keep the outside out, you become one with it. Again, another house built in Jasna, where again the boundaries of inside and out don't really matter anymore. Light coming in from there and rats running through becomes part of the way we live. Another sort of extreme of it, the entire house is built out of scaffolding. It's built on a floodplain by one of my students, I'm very happy to say. And it's so that if it becomes almost impossible to live, you can kind of, you know, unfold it, plug it up, and take it along. It's kind of like you're camping on the floodplain just for a little while. If something happens, you need to get on with it and go to slightly higher ground. It's mostly open except for the bedrooms where it's kind of glazed in, but otherwise it's just a big open space in which you can go and chill out. This is a hotel project which sort of takes on similar ideas of inserting very simple buildings into a landscape using a very simple palette of materials that again makes you very aware of your surroundings. This is up in the hills in Kandy, a wonderful part of the country, but again celebrating simple materials and the environment around us. That's a rehabilitation center for former LPP members, and this was built as a library and rehabilitation center in a place called Ambeputsa, using again rammed walls, simple stone, and framework sitting in the landscape. Constantly, this idea that you don't separate yourself from your surroundings. So that idea is really something that we now live with, and we are quite happy to go ahead with. And most Sri Lankan architects will take those ideas on as the way we think. It's inside us. We don't have to think about it because that's the way we have seen things happen. And in this project in Sigiriya, which I did about 2 years ago, it's a hotel. The reception once again, it's just completely open, and it looks through into a series of rice paddies and water, which in many ways for me connects up with a 1,000-year water system that is part of this landscape. and also looking across at this extraordinary monument, Sigiriya. We were very, very lucky, of course, that it was a long plot of land, and I could do the great long axis that Sigiriya itself had from the 5th century. But the idea here was really about the garden. The buildings are very simple huts, which they're like, I wouldn't say huts, they're kind of $600 huts, but $600 a nice hut. But it was really about creating a garden which you would experience, through which you would experience the season. So in many ways, Geoffrey's Lunuganga and all his work has really become a major legacy for us in Sri Lanka and also for people outside as well. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I will be quite happy to answer them.
Any questions?
Yes, Abha. Gosh, she's going to ask me something difficult.
Channa, when are you nominating Bawa's work as the serial nomination?
Now you're making a very private conversation public, obviously to put pressure on me. Yes, I know we have been talking about it. I promise to do it with all these witnesses before the 100 years ends next year. Our 100-year program goes on for until the 23rd of July next year, and I will start it. I will start it, and I have 6 buildings which I feel I've discussed with you as well, and let's see how that can be done. It's been a huge inspiration for all of us, and I'm sure to a lot of Asian architects. Yes, I think he deserves it, and I think we deserve it in many ways. I think South Asia deserves that we be recognized as something that changed modernity, challenged modernity simply for what it was, to make it something different. Thank you for making it public. Thank you. Yes.
This was when on the average cost of the moment. Is where our work.
I think what's interesting is that when an architect has worked so prolifically and he's built everything from schools to a university, which students in Sri Lanka, we have a system of free education. So the person who goes to those universities come from a complete cross section of society, and they experience these spaces. And you begin to see that a lot of the houses that are being built, what you would call middle class houses, a vast majority of Sri Lanka, you're beginning to see an appreciation of some of these materials and some of the ideas of the openness. Very few of those houses will actually, yes, there are horrible houses, but there are also a majority of houses, which a lot of people notice. You walk into Sri Lanka and there's a lot of this, an aesthetic which seems to happen in most places. And of course, does everybody know what Geoffrey Bawa has done? Yes, it's must be the only place in the world where the tuk-tuk driver will tell you that Geoffrey Bawa built our parliament. And that, I think, is quite something. As a question I was asked, how come that this man is known? And I feel it's because if you really look at it in detail, yes, he built for the elite. The elite pay for all of this. You can't experiment with architecture without money. But it was done in a way that somehow connected with local materials and local skills. And there was a takeaway for everybody. Yes, I can have my tile roof, it's perfectly fine. I can be modern with my tile roof. I can still have a mud wall and still be modern, that's perfectly fine. So there were bits of takeaway for all of them from that architecture. And that's probably why I think it has probably permeated a little bit further into general Sri Lankan society, as otherwise it might not, as perhaps modern architecture or the international style would not have. I hope that answers it. Yes, it appears that's it. Thank you very much for asking.